Imagine having $300 million and choosing to spend your final 20 years in a hospital room, not because you were dying, not because you needed constant medical care, but because you genuinely preferred it to your Fifth Avenue mansion with 42 rooms, and your California beach estate, and your Connecticut chateau, and basically every other luxurious option available to someone with essentially unlimited wealth. Huguette Clark was born into one of America's greatest fortunes, the kind of money where her father literally owned Montana, not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech, but actually owned significant portions of an entire state through mining operations and real estate holdings that made him one of the wealthiest men in America. Her childhood home had 42 rooms on Fifth Avenue back when Fifth Avenue actually meant something. She had a private beach estate in Santa Barbara, a chateau in Connecticut that she bought specifically as a nuclear war refuge because why not? Stradivarius violins just casually lying around. And more money than she could possibly spend, even if she tried, which she sort of did through increasingly eccentric purchases as she got older. And yet, at 76 years old, she checked into a hospital for a minor skin cancer procedure and then just never left, spending the next 2 decades living in a plain hospital room with institutional furniture and fluorescent lighting, ordering takeout food, painting elaborate dolls that she'd commissioned craftsmen to make for her, and talking on the phone to the handful of people she trusted while her magnificent properties sat completely empty, maintained by full staffs who hadn't actually seen their employer in years but kept showing up to dust mansions that nobody lived in. When she finally died at 104, which, considering her lifestyle choices, is either a testament to good genetics or proof that isolation might actually be healthy, the legal battle over her fortune revealed a life so strange, so deliberately hidden, so absolutely committed to avoiding human contact that it captivated the entire nation and raised questions nobody could quite answer. Her own family, distant relatives she hadn't seen in decades, claimed they'd been unfairly cut out of the will and that she'd been manipulated by caregivers. Her private nurse, who'd spent years as basically her only real human contact, received millions in gifts that seemed either generous or suspicious depending on who. And the question everyone wanted answered, the thing that made this story so compelling, was whether Huguette had been exploited by people who recognized a vulnerable, isolated elderly woman when they saw one, or whether she'd finally found the only people in her entire life who valued her for herself rather than seeing her as a walking trust fund. Before we drift into the peculiar, genuinely poignant story of how one of America's wealthiest women became one of its most invisible, a woman who had everything society told her she should want and chose almost none of it, drop a comment and let us know whether you'd choose complete privacy over social connection if you had unlimited wealth. Because honestly, after hearing this story, the question becomes a lot more complicated than it initially seems. Now, let's settle in and explore the life of Huguette Clark, starting with her father, because you can't understand why she ended up living in a hospital room without understanding the absolutely wild man who built the fortune that made her isolation possible. William Andrews Clark was born in 1839 in Pennsylvania to a farmer who gave him exactly what every 19th century farm boy received, enough education to read and write and do basic arithmetic, and then the strong expectation that he'd spend the rest of his life working the same land, in the same way, until he died and his own sons took over, continuing the cycle of agricultural subsistence that had defined his family for generations. But William had other ideas, specifically ideas that involved not being a farmer, because he had the kind of restless ambition that made staying in one place, doing the same thing forever, feel like a slow death. When the Civil War started, 17-year-old William made a decision that perfectly encapsulates his entire approach to life and business. Instead of enlisting and potentially dying for noble causes like preserving the Union or ending slavery, he went west to make money off the people who were actually fighting, recognizing something that separated him from most men his age, which was that there was significantly more profit in selling supplies to miners than in being a miner yourself, and considerably less chance of dying in the process. While other young men were getting shot in places like Gettysburg and Antietam, William was in the gold fields of Colorado and then Montana, quietly accumulating capital by selling tools and food and whiskey to desperate men who were willing to pay almost anything because the alternative was starving or doing without, and William was happy to provide as long as they could pay his prices. He opened a general store in Butte, Montana, which at the time was less a proper town and more a chaotic collection of tents, mud, desperate hope, and occasional violence. The kind of place that attracted men who were either running from something or running toward fortune, often both. Butte sat on top of one of the richest copper deposits on Earth, which nobody really understood yet because this was before copper became essential for electrical wiring and everyone still thought gold was where the real money was. But William had a talent for recognizing opportunities before other people did, which is really the only talent that matters if you want to get spectacularly wealthy. The general store was just his starting point, his way of accumulating enough capital to make real moves, because William understood something fundamental about frontier economics. The people actually doing the mining were basically gambling, but the person selling them supplies was running a casino, and the casino always wins eventually. He watched the miners carefully, studied which claims were paying out and which were just holes in the ground that would bankrupt whoever was digging them, learned to read geology and human nature with equal skill, and most importantly, he waited, because William Clark had patience that bordered on supernatural, and timing that seemed almost like he could see the future. When miners struck it rich, he extended them credit, let them run up tabs, became their friendly neighborhood creditor who totally had their best interests at heart. When they went bust, which most of them eventually did because mining is essentially legalized gambling with worse odds, he acquired their claims for pennies on the dollar, taking over properties that had cost some other poor fool their life savings, and adding them to his growing empire of holdings that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men in America. By the 1870s, William had transitioned from shopkeeper to mine owner, though he much preferred to let other people do the actual dangerous work of mining, while he focused on the business side. Acquisition, consolidation, political maneuvering, all the things that let you get rich without ever going underground yourself. He bought the United Verde copper mine in Arizona, which alone would eventually be worth $100 million, a sum so large it's almost impossible to conceptualize even now, and which in the 1900s, money would translate to tens of billions today. He didn't just own pieces of the copper industry, he owned the entire supply chain from extraction to processing to transportation, the kind of vertical integration that would make modern tech monopolies look like amateurs. The wealth that resulted was staggering even by Gilded Age standards, when robber barons were basically competing to see who could build the most ostentatious monument to their own success, and good taste was considered optional as long as you could afford to ignore it. William's fortune was estimated at somewhere between $150 million and $300 million. In early 1900s, money before income tax, before any of the regulations that would later limit how rich you could get, which made him not just wealthy, but powerful in ways that are hard to imagine now, when even billionaires have to occasionally pretend to care about public opinion. He built the Copper King Mansion in Butte, a 34-room testament to what happens when new money decides to prove it belongs in the same conversation as old money, and has absolutely no interest in subtlety. The mansion had frescoed ceilings painted by European artists, hand-carved woodwork that took craftsmen years to complete, stained glass windows imported from Europe because American glass apparently wasn't fancy enough, and ballrooms designed to hold hundreds of guests in a town where most people still lived in what could charitably be described as shacks, creating this absolutely surreal contrast between William's palace and the rough mining towns surrounding it. But William wasn't satisfied with just being obscenely wealthy, because what's the point of having all that money if you're still subject to laws and regulations and taxes created by people who have less money than you do? He wanted political power, specifically a U.S. Senate seat, because he understood that the richest man in Montana was still subject to government oversight, unless he was literally part of the government making the rules, which is honestly a more straightforward approach to regulatory capture than most modern billionaires manage. His first attempt to buy a Senate seat was so blatant, so thoroughly corrupt, so completely shameless, that it became a national scandal and turned him into a symbol of everything wrong with Gilded Age politics. In 1899, William attempted to bribe his way into the Montana legislature, which would then elect him to the US Senate. Because that's how it worked back then, state legislators chose senators, which meant you only needed to bribe a few dozen men instead of thousands of actual voters, making the whole process much more efficient for someone with William's resources and ethical flexibility. The problem was that William wasn't even slightly subtle about it, handing out cash openly, promising positions and contracts, making deals that were barely disguised as legitimate business transactions, basically doing everything except literally putting price tags on legislators' foreheads. When the scandal broke and people started actually investigating, the details were absolutely delicious. Envelopes full of money, changing hands in hotel rooms, explicit quid pro quo arrangements written down on paper, like William thought he was running a regular business instead of a bribery operation. Legislators who'd been too drunk during the transactions to remember taking the bribes, but who testified about them anyway, once they sobered up and realized they were probably going to get caught. The Senate refused to seat him, which honestly was the bare minimum response to someone who'd bribed his way into office with all the subtlety of a cartoon villain. William became a national symbol of corruption, the embodiment of everything progressives were complaining about when they said the system was rigged in favor of the wealthy. Editorial cartoons depicted him as literally a bag of money wearing a suit, newspapers that he didn't own, because he'd learned to buy up media outlets the way other people bought real estate, understanding that controlling the narrative was almost as important as controlling the minds, wrote scathing exposés about his business practices, his political machinations, his personal life, every aspect of his existence that could be used to illustrate how the Gilded Age was basically a playground for rich men who didn't care about rules. The scandal would have destroyed a less determined man, maybe convinced him to retire quietly and enjoy his massive fortune without trying to buy political office. William simply waited a few years for people's memories to fade, then tried again with slightly more subtlety, or at least with better lawyers who knew how to structure bribes so they looked like legitimate campaign expenditure. In 1901, he was legitimately elected to the Senate. And while legitimately is doing a lot of work in that sentence considering he spent absolutely enormous sums on the campaign and used his newspaper empire to destroy his opponents and deployed his business influence with surgical precision, the votes were counted and the election was certified, and William Andrews Clark became Senator Clark. He served one term, seemed to realize pretty quickly that being a senator was far more tedious and far less powerful than being a copper magnate who could just buy senators, and declined to run again, having apparently proven whatever point he was trying to make about how money could overcome even massive public scandal, if you were patient and shameless enough about it. But while William was building his empire and buying his political career, and generally demonstrating that wealth and ethics are not necessarily related concepts, his personal life was crumbling in ways that all his money couldn't actually fix, which is almost satisfying from a karmic perspective, except that it mostly made everyone around him miserable. His first wife, Catherine, had married him when he was an ambitious shopkeeper with potential rather than a copper king with power, which means she'd lived through all the early struggles, the gradual accumulation of wealth, the transformation from frontier merchant to industrial titan, watching him become someone completely different from the man she'd married. Somewhere along that journey, the marriage had deteriorated into the kind of arrangement that was common among the very wealthy in that era. They maintained appearances, lived in the same massive houses, attended the same social functions, presented a united front to the world, and had absolutely nothing resembling actual intimacy or affection. Just two people sharing space and a last name, while living essentially separate emotional lives. Catherine died in 1893. Officially from various medical complications, but realistically from the slow grinding misery of being married to a man who valued her primarily as a social accessory and the mother of his legitimate children, someone who made him look respectable while he pursued business and political ambitions that had nothing to do. William mourned appropriately, wore black for the expected period, made all the right public statements about loss and grief, and then did something that shocked even Montana's relatively scandal-hardened society, which had thought it was beyond being shocked by William Clark at this point. He revealed that he'd been married to someone else the entire time. Anna Eugenia Lachapelle was nearly 40 years younger than William, a beautiful French-Canadian woman who'd been his mistress for years while Catherine was still alive, and they'd secretly married in France and had 2 daughters together, André and Huguette, maintaining this entire separate family, while William was still legally married to Catherine and presenting himself as a devoted husband back in Montana. It was the kind of revelation that should have been absolutely catastrophic for his reputation, the kind of scandal that would normally destroy someone's social standing and business relationships and political ambitions all at once. And it probably would have destroyed anyone else, but William was so wealthy, so powerful, and so utterly indifferent to public opinion that the scandal eventually just sort of dissipated like smoke, because what were people going to do? Stop buying copper? Stop doing business with one of the richest men in America? Socially ostracize someone who could buy and sell most of them? People whispered. Newspapers wrote stern editorials about moral decay and the corruption of the wealthy, society. Matrons clutched their pearls and refused invitations for maybe 6 months. And then everyone just sort of moved on, because money has a way of making people forget their principles. William married Anna publicly in 1901, legitimizing their daughters and making Anna the official Mrs. William Clark, and then he set about building them a life that would demonstrate to everyone, especially the people who'd looked down on Anna as a mistress and their daughters as illegitimate, that he'd won at capitalism so thoroughly that their opinions literally didn't matter anymore. Huguette Clark was born on June 9, 1906, in Paris, because of course she was. Wealthy Americans in the early 1900s didn't just have babies in normal hospitals like regular people, they went to Paris to give birth so their children could have the kind of sophisticated international upbringing that signaled real cultural refinement rather than just piles of money. Though obviously the piles of money were essential to making the whole thing work. Her name, Huguette, was French and melodious and unusual enough to stand out, but not so unusual that it seemed completely made up, meaning little spirit or bright in mind and spirit, which might have been aspirational, or might have just been Anna's preference for French nomenclature over boring American names like Mary or Elizabeth. Either way, Huguette would spend her entire life with a name that marked her as different, that required explanation to Americans who'd never heard it before, that set her apart before people even met her, which is probably not ideal for someone who would eventually develop a pathological need for privacy and invisibility, but nobody was thinking about that in 1906. She had one sibling, her older sister André, who was 8 when Huguette was born, and the two girls were raised primarily in France during their early years, living in Parisian elegance while their father conducted business in America and visited periodically, bringing gifts and stories and the slightly uncomfortable presence of a man who was more patriarch than parent, someone whose approval mattered enormously, but who wasn't really involved in the daily work of raising them. Their mother Anna devoted herself to the girls' education with the intensity of someone who understood that raising daughters for William Clark's world required more than just teaching them to look pretty and make polite conversation, though those things were certainly also required and extensively taught. The girls needed to speak multiple languages: French, English, German, Italian, not just conversationally like tourists ordering wine, but fluently, with proper accent and cultural context, and the ability to discuss literature and philosophy and current events in each language as if they were native speakers. They needed to play musical instruments, not just competently, but beautifully, spending hours each day practicing scales and pieces on harp and violin until their small fingers ached, and they could perform with the kind of technical perfection that demonstrated both talent and the expensive education that had cultivated that talent. They needed to understand art, not just how to look at it and say nice things, but actually understand composition and color theory and art history, to paint and draw with skill that went beyond accomplished amateurism into genuine artistic ability. They needed to know literature, both classic and contemporary, in multiple languages. They needed to understand history, geography, mathematics that they'd probably never use but needed to know well enough to seem educated to people who valued education as a marker of class. They were being prepared not just for wealthy society, but for the absolute pinnacle of it, where knowing how to paint was expected, and knowing how to paint really well was what separated the merely rich from the truly refined, where speaking French was assumed, and speaking it better than native Parisians was what got you invited to the really exclusive salons. Huguette showed early aptitude for art that went beyond dutiful completion of assignments, demonstrating real talent in her watercolors even as a young child, with a delicacy and attention to detail that suggested she might actually have an artistic gift, rather than just the technical skills that expensive tutors could teach anyone with enough patience. She could sit for hours working on a single painting, completely absorbed in getting the light exactly right, the colors precisely balanced, the composition just so, displaying the kind of focused concentration that would later characterize her entire approach to life. When she cared about something, she cared about it completely and obsessively, and when she didn't care, she didn't even pretend to. She was quiet, observant, the sort of child who listened more than she spoke, and seemed to be cataloguing everything around her for some future purpose that wasn't quite clear yet. While André was more outgoing and socially confident, the kind of girl who could walk into a room full of strangers and start charming everyone within minutes, Huguette was content to stay in the background, watching, learning, storing away observations about how people behaved and what they really meant beneath their polite words, developing the hypervigilance that often comes with being different or feeling like you don't quite fit in. In 1911, when Huguette was 5 years old, the family moved to New York City, where William had built them what can only be described as an absolutely absurd monument to his success that made even the Copper King mansion in Butte look almost restrained by comparison, which is saying something considering the Butte mansion was already ridiculously ostentatious. The Clark mansion at 960 Fifth Avenue was magnificent in the way that Gilded Age new money was magnificent. Overwhelming, excessive, designed to make absolutely certain that everyone who saw it understood that the Clarks had more money than God and wanted you to know it. It occupied an entire block front, rose several stories into the Manhattan sky, and contained 42 rooms, each one decorated with the kind of opulent excess that happens when you have unlimited money, and taste is really more of a suggestion than a requirement. There were ballrooms with ceilings painted by European artists who'd been imported specifically for this project, libraries filled with first editions in leather bindings that may or may not have ever been read, music rooms with perfect acoustics and instruments that cost more than most people's houses, a swimming pool in the basement which was absolutely revolutionary for 1911 when most people were still bathing in tin tubs. The mansion had art galleries filled with paintings and sculptures that William had collected, not because he particularly understood or appreciated art. By all accounts, he thought most of it was weird and didn't see the point, but because owning important art was what important men did. And William was nothing if not determined to do everything that important men were supposed to do, whether or not he actually enjoyed any of it. Every single detail of the mansion was designed to impress, to overwhelm, to make visitors understand immediately and viscerally that the Clarks were not just wealthy, but monumentally, almost incomprehensibly wealthy, operating on a level of wealth that most people couldn't even imagine. The imported marble, the custom woodwork, the crystal chandeliers, the Persian rugs, the gardens designed by landscape architects who normally worked on public parks, all of it screamed new money trying to prove it belongs with old money in a way that was simultaneously impressive and slightly embarrassing. But here's the really interesting thing about the Fifth Avenue mansion and the Clark family's attempt to establish themselves in New York society. It didn't actually work, at least not the way they wanted it to, because New York's elite in 1911 had very firm ideas about who belonged and who didn't. And the Clarks, with their Montana mining fortune, their scandal-tinged history, their slightly too obvious wealth that lacked the patina of generations, didn't quite make the cut, which must have been infuriating for William, who'd successfully bought his way into basically everything else he'd ever wanted. They were received, certainly, because you couldn't just completely ignore someone as wealthy as William Clark without looking petty and small. People accepted their invitations, attended their dinners, made polite conversation, admired the mansion with the kind of careful compliments that can mean either genuine appreciation or veiled mockery depending on your tone. But there was a difference between being accepted and actually belonging, and the Clarks never quite managed to cross that line no matter how much money they spent or how perfect their parties were. The Astors looked down on them with the particular disdain that old money reserves for new money that's trying too hard. The Vanderbilts were cordial but distant, maintaining exactly the kind of polite friendliness that makes it clear you're not actually friends. The old Knickerbocker families, whose fortunes were barely older than William's, but who acted like they'd been aristocrats since the Mayflower, treated the Clarks with the kind of condescension that's almost an art form, being perfectly polite while making it absolutely clear that you're not really one of us and never will be, no matter how many ballrooms you build. It bothered Anna more than William, probably because William had never particularly cared what people thought of him and wasn't about to start just because some families whose money was maybe 2 generations older felt superior. But for the girls, especially Huguette, it created this strange childhood where they had everything money could buy, the finest clothes from Parisian designers, jewelry that most adults would never own in their entire lives, trips to Europe on luxury ocean liners, boxes at the opera, private tutors for every possible subject, literally anything they could want. But they also had this subtle, constant awareness that they were outsiders, that their 42-room mansion and their father's copper fortune didn't quite compensate for being the daughters of a man who'd scandalized 2 states and maintained a secret second family. Huguette's early childhood in the mansion was sheltered to what we'd now recognize as an almost abusive degree, though nobody was thinking about child development or healthy socialization in 1911. Anna, perhaps because she'd experienced her own social ostracism as William's mistress before becoming his wife, or perhaps because she genuinely feared for her daughters in a city that could be cruel to young girls, especially young girls whose legitimacy had once been questioned, kept them isolated from almost all outside contact that wasn't carefully controlled and supervised. They didn't attend school with other children like normal kids. No classroom experiences, no playground friendships, no learning how to navigate social hierarchies and make friends and handle conflicts and all the other skills that come from actually interacting with peers. They had tutors who came to the mansion to teach them individually, which meant excellent education but zero social development. They didn't play in Central Park with other children from wealthy families, didn't have spontaneous play dates, didn't do any of the normal things that even wealthy children usually got to do. They had private grounds attached to the mansion, private rooms, private everything, their entire world carefully curated and controlled by adults who decided who they could see and when, and under what circumstances. Their social interactions were limited to other children from families that Anna deemed appropriate, which was a very short list, and even those interactions were supervised, structured, scheduled, completely controlled by adults who were watching to make sure nothing inappropriate happened, which probably made normal childhood friendship basically impossible, because how do you actually become friends with someone when there's always an adult hovering nearby, making sure you don't do anything wrong? It created this strange hothouse existence where Huguette and André had vast material resources. Anything they wanted they could have, any toy or book or dress or trip, but very limited real-world experience of the kind that actually prepares you for independent life. They knew how to behave at formal dinners with multiple courses and too much silverware, but had never been to a corner store to buy candy. They could discuss art and literature in multiple languages, but had rarely had an unscripted conversation with someone their own age. They were being raised for a very specific kind of life, wealthy, refined, carefully controlled, and that preparation came at the cost of basically every normal childhood experience that might have taught them how to be functional adults. And then something happened that crystallized Huguette's fear of the outside world in a way that would shape absolutely everything that came after, that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her very long life. In April 1912, when Huguette was almost 6 years old, her father's niece, a young woman also named Anna La Chapelle, sharing her mother's name in a way that must have been confusing at family gatherings, boarded the RMS Titanic for its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. The ship was everything the Gilded Age believed about progress and luxury and humanity's triumph over nature. Massive, beautiful, technologically advanced, unsinkable according to everyone who mattered. The floating embodiment of the idea that enough money and engineering could overcome any obstacle, including basic physics and the ocean itself. When the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank, taking Anna and 1,500 other people down with it into the freezing North Atlantic, the tragedy rippled through the Clark family in ways that went far beyond normal grief, creating trauma that would influence family dynamics and individual psychology for decades. For Huguette, who was old enough to understand what had happened but young enough to process it as a fundamental lesson about how the world worked, the sinking represented something absolutely terrifying. That even the greatest achievements, the most expensive safeguards, the most confident assertions of safety and invulnerability could fail completely and catastrophically. That death could come out of nowhere and take people you loved, regardless of their wealth or social position or how carefully they'd planned everything. She developed a fear of the ocean that would last her entire life, a deep, visceral terror that no amount of rational explanation could overcome. She would cross it when absolutely necessary for family obligations or important trips, but she never enjoyed it, never felt safe on ships regardless of how modern or well-built they supposedly were, never shook that childhood understanding that water was dangerous and distance was risky, and the only real safety came from staying in controlled, familiar environments where you could see all the threats coming. The Titanic disaster reinforced every protective instinct Anna already had, validating all her anxieties about the dangerous world outside their mansion. If even the unsinkable could sink, if even the safest ship ever built could kill 1,500 people in a matter of hours, then the only logical response was to control everything possible. Eliminate every risk you could identify. Keep your children close and safe and protected from all the dangers that lurked in a world that seemed determined to hurt people, no matter how carefully you tried to avoid it. But all the protection in the world, all the careful isolation and controlled environments and obsessive safety measures couldn't protect against what was about to happen, couldn't prevent the tragedy that would hit even closer than the Titanic and fundamentally alter Huguette's life in ways that would echo for the next 90 years. Huguette Clark was everything a Gilded Age daughter was supposed to be. Beautiful in that effortless way that photographs well, accomplished in all the approved feminine arts without being threatening about it, socially graceful enough to make conversation sparkle at dinner parties, while never saying anything so interesting that it might overshadow the men. The kind of girl who could make everyone in a room feel charmed, without anyone being able to articulate exactly what she'd done to achieve that effect. She played piano beautifully, spoke 4 languages fluently enough to impress European aristocrats, had impeccable manners that had been drilled into her since she could walk, and possessed the kind of natural social confidence that Huguette completely lacked, the ability to walk into a room full of strangers and somehow make them all feel like old friends within about 15 minutes. Where Huguette was quiet and observant, essentially living in her own head and watching the world like she was taking notes for some future purpose that wasn't quite clear yet, André was warm and engaging, genuinely interested in people, or at least really good at faking it, which in high society amounts to the same thing. Where Huguette preferred her art studio and could happily spend entire days alone painting watercolors without speaking to a single person, André actually enjoyed social occasions, thrived on the energy of parties and gatherings, seemed to genuinely like the endless round of teas and luncheons and dinners that defined wealthy women's lives. They were complementary rather than competitive, probably because the 8-year age gap prevented the kind of sibling rivalry that might have developed if they'd been closer in age and fighting for the same social space, and also because they were genuinely different enough that they weren't competing for the same role in the family or the same kind of attention from their parents. André had recently discovered a passion for the Girl Scouts, which in 1919 was still a relatively new organization. It had only been founded in 1912, but one that appealed to her sense of purpose and service, and probably also to her desire to do something meaningful beyond just being a decorative member of high society waiting to make an advantageous marriage. She threw herself into scouting with the kind of characteristic enthusiasm she brought to everything, organizing activities for younger girls, mentoring them in outdoor skills and civic responsibility, generally finding meaning in something beyond the narrow social calendar that defined most wealthy girls' entire existence, and probably frustrated her, even though she was good at it. She was 16 years old, healthy, vibrant, in that stage of life where everything still feels possible, and death seems like something that happens to other people, especially old people. Definitely not to wealthy teenagers with their whole futures spread out before them like an all-you-can-eat buffet of options. She was preparing for her debutante season, looking forward to being formally presented to society, thinking about all the experiences that lay ahead. Marriage eventually, perhaps, or maybe college, which was becoming more acceptable for wealthy girls, or travel, or whatever future she might choose from the absolutely abundant options her wealth and position offered. Options that most people could only dream about while she got to actually select from them like items on a menu. And then, with the absolutely terrifying suddenness that characterized so many deaths before modern antibiotics made bacterial infections, something you could actually survive with a simple prescription instead of a funeral, she contracted meningitis, which is one of those infections that can go from "I have a headache" to "she's dead" so fast it doesn't even seem real. The illness moved with horrifying speed, faster than anyone could really process or respond to effectively. One day, Andre had a headache and felt tired, which seemed like nothing particularly concerning because everyone gets headaches and feels tired sometimes. 2 days later, she had a fever and was delirious, her temperature climbing to levels that were clearly dangerous, but that doctors in 1919 had very limited ability to actually treat beyond cold compresses and hope that her body could fight it off. 4 days after the first symptoms appeared, she was dead, despite every doctor William's enormous wealth could summon to her bedside. And he summoned a lot of them, probably every specialist in California, despite every treatment available in 1919, which honestly wasn't much beyond supportive care and prayer, despite frantic negotiations with God and the universe, and anyone who might be listening about how this couldn't be happening. Not to his daughter, not when he had all this money that was supposed to protect his family from exactly this kind of tragedy. Andre died on October 17th, 1919, at the Clark family's summer home in Santa Barbara, California, in a room overlooking the Pacific Ocean that should have been filled with light and beauty, but was instead filled with grief and the absolutely incomprehensible reality that a healthy 16-year-old had simply stopped existing. She was 16 years old, which meant she died before really living in any meaningful adult sense, before experiencing most of the things she'd been so carefully prepared for, before becoming whoever she might have been if she'd had the chance to grow up and figure herself out and live the life that wealth and position should have guaranteed her, but absolutely didn't. The loss devastated the entire family in the way that losing a child devastates any family, regardless of how much money they have, because it turns out that wealth can buy almost anything except protection from random bacterial infections. But it destroyed something fundamental in Huguette that never really recovered, that shaped everything about how she would live the rest of her very long life. She was 13 years old when Andre died, which is possibly the worst age to experience this kind of loss, because you're old enough to fully understand what death means, to grasp that gone is permanent and forever, but you're not old enough to have developed any real coping mechanisms or perspective that might help you process grief in anything resembling a healthy way. She'd lost her sister, her companion, the person who'd shared her entire childhood and understood what it was like to be a Clark daughter in ways that nobody else could. And the loss came with the absolutely terrifying understanding that death could take anyone at any time, regardless of their age or health or how much money their father had. That even youth and vitality and the best medical care money could buy weren't actually protection against simply ceasing to exist. Huguette began keeping a diary addressed to Andre, writing letters to her dead sister as if the conversation between them could continue across the barrier of death if she just kept talking, kept sharing her thoughts and daily details and questions that would never be answered. The entries were heartbreaking in their mix of mundane daily observations and profound grief. She'd tell Andre about her painting lessons and what she'd had for lunch, and then suddenly ask why she'd left, why death had taken her, whether she was all right wherever she was now. Questions that have been asked by grieving people throughout human history and never adequately answered. Because how do you answer questions about death and separation when you don't actually know anything beyond the fact that someone is gone and not coming back? The diary became a way to process what fundamentally couldn't be processed, to maintain some kind of connection with someone who was gone, to refuse to fully accept that André was dead and their relationship was over, that she'd never talk to her sister again, or hear her laugh, or get advice, or share experiences the way they'd always done. Huguette would keep writing these letters for years, filling page after page with observations and questions and memories, creating a one-sided correspondence that let her pretend, at least on paper, that she wasn't completely alone, that some part of André still existed somewhere and was receiving these messages, and maybe even responding in ways that Huguette couldn't quite perceive, but chose to believe in anyway. Her parents' response to André's death was to retreat even further from the world that had already felt dangerous and threatening, as if they could protect their remaining daughter by simply removing every possible risk from her life, even if that meant essentially removing her from normal life entirely. They withdrew from society almost completely, which for people who'd been trying so hard to establish themselves in New York's social elite must have felt like admitting defeat. But apparently losing a daughter made social status seem less important than keeping the remaining daughter alive by any means necessary. The grand balls and dinner parties that had filled the Fifth Avenue mansion with light and music and hundreds of guests, all those events that were supposed to establish the Clarks as legitimate members of New York society, just stopped happening. The ballrooms that had been designed to impress now sat empty, maintained by staff but never used, monuments to social ambitions that grief had made irrelevant. Visitors were discouraged and then essentially forbidden because every visitor represented a potential source of germs or illness or danger, every interaction with the outside world a risk that might lead to another devastating loss. The Clarks began living in their 42-room mansion as if they were under siege from invisible enemies, with the dangers of illness and death lurking just outside their gates, waiting for any opportunity to strike again. And the only defense was complete isolation from anything that might carry disease. Anna developed an intense paranoia about germs and disease that, while completely understandable for someone who'd watched her daughter die from an infection that had seemed minor until suddenly it was fatal, manifested in increasingly extreme and probably counterproductive precautions that turned their mansion into something closer to a medical facility than a home. Huguette was kept away from other children even more strictly than before, which is saying something considering she'd already been pretty isolated. But now the isolation became absolute and non-negotiable. Any slight illness, a cold, a cough, a sneeze, anything that might potentially signal the beginning of something worse, triggered near panic in Anna and William, who would immediately summon doctors and implement quarantine measures that probably seemed excessive even by the standards of 1919, when people were generally more worried about infectious disease than we are now. The family's household staff was instructed to maintain almost hospital-level hygiene, washing their hands constantly, staying home if they felt even slightly unwell, basically treating the mansion like it housed someone with a severely compromised immune system even though Huguette was perfectly healthy. Visitors were scrutinized for any sign of illness and turned away if they so much as sniffled, because who knows, maybe that sniffle was the beginning of meningitis or influenza or tuberculosis, or any of the other infectious diseases that could kill you in 1919 before antibiotics made most of them easily treatable annoyances rather than death sentences. William channeled his grief and his need to do something meaningful with the loss into building a monument to André that would ensure she wasn't forgotten, that her life had meant something beyond the 16 years she'd lived. In 1920, he donated land and substantial funds to create Camp André Clark for Girl Scouts in Santa Barbara, near where André had died, which was both a beautiful gesture and probably psychologically complicated for everyone involved. It was a way to ensure that André's passion for scouting would continue even though she couldn't, that other girls could have the outdoor experiences and sense of purpose and community that André had valued so much, that something good could come from something devastating, which is the kind of meaning-making that people need to do after loss, even when it doesn't actually make the loss hurt any less. But for Huguette, the camp was both memorial and constant reminder, a place that kept André's memory alive, but also kept the wound fresh, because every time the family visited Santa Barbara, every time the camp was mentioned in conversation, every time there was any reference to it at all, she was confronted again with her sister's absence, with the future André should have had. with the fundamental unfairness of a world where a healthy 16-year-old could simply stop existing because of random bacterial infection. The teenage years that should have been about social development and forming friendships and experiencing independence and figuring out who you are separate from your family, all the normal adolescent experiences that help you become a functional adult, were instead years of intensifying isolation and unprocessed grief and protection that was probably more harmful than any of the dangers it was meant to prevent. While other wealthy girls her age were having debutante balls and attending parties and meeting potential suitors and learning how to navigate social situations and relationships, Huguette was essentially quarantined in the Fifth Avenue mansion, protected from every possible danger except loneliness and the kind of isolation that damages your ability to form normal human connections. She threw herself into art with even more intensity than before, painting becoming not just a skill or an accomplishment but a genuine escape, a way to create worlds on canvas that were beautiful and controlled and couldn't hurt her the way the real world had hurt her by taking away her sister. She could spend entire days in her art studio working on watercolors or oils, perfecting technique, losing herself in color and composition, and the meditative focus that artistic work required, creating beauty that was safe because it only existed on canvas and couldn't die or leave or disappoint. She also continued her music, particularly the violin, which she played with increasing skill and emotional depth that probably reflected all the feelings she couldn't or wouldn't express in words to the living people around her. The violin became another outlet for grief and loneliness, and the peculiar sadness of being the only surviving child of parents who were absolutely terrified of losing her too. So terrified that they'd essentially imprisoned her in luxury to keep her safe, which is possibly the most expensive form of overprotective parenting ever invented. Her father, meanwhile, was aging in the way that very elderly people age when they've accomplished everything they set out to do professionally, but are facing loss and mortality in their personal life. William Clark was in his 70s by the time André died, still mentally sharp and capable of managing his business empire, but beginning to slow physically, beginning to confront his own mortality and worry about what would happen to his fortune and his empire, and most importantly, his remaining daughter when he died and couldn't protect her anymore. He worried particularly about fortune hunters, men who would see Huguette not as a person with thoughts and feelings and value beyond her inheritance, but purely as access to the Clark millions, as a walking trust fund who could be married and then controlled and financially exploited for the rest of her life. It was a legitimate concern in an era when women's property rights were still extremely limited despite some legal progress, when marriage often meant effective legal and financial subordination to your husband, when a man could essentially take control of his wife's fortune through marriage, and there was very little she could do about it if he chose to be controlling or exploitative. William began warning Huguette explicitly and repeatedly about this danger, having conversations with her that probably seemed protective to him but were actually deeply damaging to her ability to ever trust anyone. He told her that men would lie to her, that they'd pretend to love her when they really loved her money, that romantic declarations should always be viewed with maximum suspicion because anyone claiming to care about her was probably running a con. He essentially taught her that authentic human connection was impossible for someone in her position, that her wealth made her simultaneously desirable and unable to trust whether that desire was genuine, that she should assume everyone was lying to her about their motivations because they probably were. These warnings, combined with her grief over André and the family's general withdrawal from society, and the increasingly severe isolation she was experiencing, didn't exactly prepare Huguette for healthy adult relationships, which is possibly the understatement of the century. By the time she turned 16, then 17, then 18, ages when most wealthy girls of her era would have been presented to society in elaborate debutante balls, attending parties and dinners and gatherings designed specifically to introduce them to eligible young men from appropriate families, beginning the careful social dance that was supposed to lead to advantageous marriages that would maintain or improve the family's social and financial position. Huguette had essentially missed all of that, and her debut into society never really happened in any meaningful way. There was no grand ball where she was presented to New York society wearing white and carrying flowers, while hundreds of people applauded her entrance into eligible marriageability. There was no season of parties where she could meet appropriate young men under properly chaperoned circumstances. There was none of the normal social development that was supposed to prepare wealthy girls for marriage and motherhood, and managing large households, and all the other things that elite women of that era were expected to do as their primary life purpose. She remained in the mansion painting and playing violin, and writing to her dead sister, living a life that was materially luxurious in every possible way. Anything she wanted she could have, any art supplies or instruments or books or clothes, but emotionally impoverished in ways that money couldn't fix. Wealthy beyond measure, but profoundly isolated from any kind of normal human connection or experience that might have taught her how to function in the world beyond her family's protective bubble. In 1923, when Huguette was 17 years old, the family made a change that would further limit her already severely limited social world, though it was framed as a practical business decision rather than continued isolation. New York State had instituted a new income tax, and William Clark, who'd spent his entire very successful life minimizing taxes through various creative means, both legal and questionably legal, decided the solution was elegantly simple. They'd just move. Not far, because that would be inconvenient and require actually changing their lifestyle in significant ways. Just across the river to an enormous apartment in a Manhattan co-op at 907 Fifth Avenue, right next to Central Park, close enough that you could walk to their old mansion in about 10 minutes. Technically, this put them outside New York State's tax jurisdiction, while changing essentially nothing about their actual daily life except their legal address for tax purposes, which is the kind of move only the extremely wealthy can make. Changing your residence to avoid taxes while maintaining exactly the same lifestyle in almost exactly the same location. The new apartment was smaller than the 42-room mansion in the sense that anything would be smaller than a 42-room mansion, but it was still enormous by any normal standard. Multiple floors, plenty of space for Huguette's art studio, room for Anna's ever-growing collections of art and furniture and decorative objects, enough bedrooms that they could still theoretically host guests if they ever decided to start hosting guests again, which they had no intention of doing because guests carried germs and represented social obligations they no longer cared about. And it was in this new apartment, in this slightly smaller but still ridiculously luxurious prison of wealth and isolation, that Huguette met the man who would give her painting lessons and, completely inadvertently, set the stage for the first and only significant romantic relationship of her entire very long life. A relationship that would be characterized by unrequited longing and eventual traumatic failure in ways that would convince her to never try again. After William Clark died in March 1925, peacefully in his sleep at age 86, having lived long enough to see his copper empire consolidated, his fortune secured, his political point proven, and one daughter buried, which is 3 out of 4 major life goals accomplished, if you don't count keeping both your children alive, Huguette found herself in the peculiar position that would be instantly familiar to anyone who's ever inherited substantial wealth and suddenly discovered they have a lot of new friends who are very interested in their well-being. She was 19 years old, one of the wealthiest women in America, with an inheritance that made her financially independent enough to never need to work or marry or do anything she didn't want to do, living in a massive apartment with her grieving mother, and almost completely unprepared for the attention that comes with being both young and extraordinarily rich and female in 1920s New York, which was basically like being a lottery winner, except the lottery was your father dying and leaving you millions of dollars instead of the usual grief and childhood home full of memories. William's warnings about fortune hunters probably seemed incredibly relevant in the months after his death, echoing in Huguette's head every time any man showed any interest in her whatsoever, which honestly must have made normal social interaction basically impossible. He'd spent considerable time during her teenage years explaining to her in detail that men would lie, that they'd pretend to care about her when they really cared about her money, that romantic declarations should always be viewed with profound suspicion because everyone was probably running some kind of con. It was like having a very wealthy, very paranoid dating coach who assumed everyone was a scam artist, which isn't entirely unreasonable, given that many people probably were interested in her money, but also made it essentially impossible for her to trust anyone's interest as potentially genuine. But Huguette was also 19, isolated beyond what's healthy for anyone, let alone a teenager, desperately lonely in ways she probably couldn't fully articulate even to herself, and experiencing that particular kind of hunger for connection that comes from years of having essentially no social contact beyond your immediate family. She'd spent her entire adolescence essentially locked in the family's apartment, protected from germs and fortune hunters, and basically any human contact that hadn't been thoroughly vetted, which resulted in someone who was exceptionally well educated in completely impractical things like watercolor painting and violin performance and speaking 4 languages, but who had almost no idea how normal human relationships actually worked, beyond what she'd observed from a distance or read about in books. This is where Tadej Stejka enters the story, and honestly, you couldn't design a more problematic situation if you were specifically trying to set up an unhealthy dynamic that would reinforce all of Huguette's isolation and trust issues. Stejka was a Polish painter who'd established himself in New York's art world as a competent portraitist and teacher. The kind of artist who was talented enough to make a living from his work, but who relied heavily on wealthy patrons and students to supplement what he made from actual art sales, which is basically the economic model for most working artists throughout history. Create the art you're passionate about while paying the bills by teaching rich people who want to feel artistic, cultured. He was hired to give Huguette painting lessons, which seemed safe enough on the surface because he was married, which theoretically removed any romantic complications since he was already taken, and therefore couldn't be a fortune hunter seeking to marry her for her money. He was professional, had genuine talent, and could actually help her develop her considerable artistic abilities, which were real, and not just the accomplished amateurism that wealthy women were expected to demonstrate. He treated her like a serious artist rather than a bored rich girl playing at creativity, which was probably the first time any man outside her family had treated her like she had value beyond her inheritance. What could possibly go wrong with this situation? Literally everything, as it turns out. What went wrong was that Huguette, who had virtually no experience with men outside her family, who'd been isolated for years in ways that stunted her social and emotional development, who was absolutely starving for intellectual connection and creative guidance, and any kind of meaningful interaction with someone who saw her as a person, developed feelings for her art teacher, which is such a predictable pattern. It's almost a cliché, except that knowing it's predictable doesn't make it any less painful when it happens to you. This is a dynamic that's repeated itself throughout human history. Student falls for teacher because the teacher represents knowledge and attention and sees potential in them. Patient falls for therapist because the therapist listens and provides emotional support. Anyone who's isolated and vulnerable develops feelings for the person who's showing them attention and respect and treating them like they matter. It doesn't mean the feelings aren't real, but it does mean they're probably based more on the dynamic and what the person represents than on who they actually are as a complete human being. Stejka was everything her father had warned her about: charming, handsome in that brooding European artist way that probably seemed incredibly romantic to a 19-year-old who'd never really known any men outside her family. Someone who praised her work and encouraged her talent, and also everything that made her father's warnings seem paranoid and excessive, because he was married and seemingly uninterested in her romantically and genuinely focused on helping her improve as an artist, his interest appearing professional rather than predatory or mercenary. For several years through her late teens and early 20s, Huguette painted under Stejka's instruction and improved dramatically, developing technical skills and artistic confidence that suggested she could have had a legitimate career as an artist if she'd been born into different circumstances or a different era when women could actually have careers beyond being wives and mothers. She created delicate watercolors that showed real talent, not just the kind of accomplished but derivative work that wealthy amateurs produce, but genuinely original and skilled art that galleries would have taken seriously if anyone had known she was creating it beyond the small circle of people who saw her work. But she also filled her diary with observations about Stejka that ranged from artistic appreciation to barely disguised longing. writing about him in ways that make you want to go back in time and gently suggest that maybe she should talk to someone about these feelings instead of just pouring them into a diary where they'd fester and grow without any reality check. She was experiencing what we'd now recognize as an intense crush or unrequited infatuation, except she had no framework for understanding it as that. No friends to talk her through it and point out that sometimes you develop feelings for people who don't and won't reciprocate, and it's painful but normal. And eventually you process it and move on to someone who's actually available and interested. Instead, she just kept painting with him and writing about him and hoping that somehow he'd notice her feelings and reciprocate them, even though he was married and had given no indication of romantic interest, and was probably either completely oblivious to her feelings or deliberately ignoring them to maintain professional boundaries because he wasn't actually interested in breaking up his marriage for a student, regardless of how wealthy she was. Meanwhile, Anna was watching this whole dynamic unfold with growing concern, probably wondering if hiring an art teacher had been a catastrophic mistake, but also not quite sure what to do about it, because firing him would eliminate the one activity that brought Huguette genuine joy and might actually make things worse by making the longing more intense through absence. There were no good options. Keep him and watch her daughter pine for someone unavailable, or fire him and lose the one positive thing in Huguette's increasingly isolated life, while possibly intensifying her obsession with him. But before the situation with Steiker could develop into anything more complicated or potentially resolve itself through time and maturity, someone else appeared who seemed, at least initially, like a much safer and more appropriate prospect for a romantic relationship. William MacDonald Gower was a law student at Columbia University, which in the 1920s meant essentially the same thing it means now. Someone ambitious enough to pursue professional education, presumably intelligent enough to handle the academic work, preparing for a career that could be quite lucrative if you did it right, except with significantly more formal clothing and definitely more smoking, because everyone smoked constantly in the 1920s like it was an Olympic sport. He was 26 to Huguette's 19, which was a fairly normal age gap for that era when men were expected to establish themselves professionally before marriage, and women were expected to marry young before they got too old and became unmarriageable spinsters, which apparently happened around age 25, according to social conventions that seem absolutely insane from a modern perspective. He came from a respectable family, not Clark-level wealthy, obviously because almost nobody was Clark-level wealthy except maybe Rockefeller and Carnegie and a handful of other industrial titans, but comfortable upper middle class with enough money to send their son to Columbia Law School, which wasn't cheap, but not enough money to make him independently wealthy or eliminate the need to actually work for a living. In other words, exactly the kind of background that could represent either legitimate romantic interest in Huguette as a person, or calculated fortune hunting aimed at her inheritance, depending entirely on his actual motivations, which probably even he didn't completely understand. Gower began courting Huguette in a way that seemed appropriate and proper by 1920s standards. Attention, conversation, treating her like someone worth pursuing for herself rather than just a bank account with a pretty face attached to it, and whether this was genuine affection or an excellent performance worthy of an Academy Award, we genuinely cannot know from historical distance, and possibly even Gower himself didn't entirely know, because people are complicated and it's entirely possible to be simultaneously attracted to a person and to their enormous fortune, without being entirely clear on which is the primary motivation or whether the two can even be meaningfully separated. Huguette, with almost no experience of male attention beyond her unrequited longing for her married art teacher and her father's constant warnings that everyone was lying to her, responded to Gower's interest with what appears to have been genuine feeling and hope that maybe this was the real connection she'd been longing for, that maybe not everyone was a fortune hunter, that maybe she could have something normal and romantic and real, like the relationships she'd read about in books. She was 19 years old, lonely in ways that probably caused actual physical pain, recently bereaved of the father who'd simultaneously protected and isolated her, and here was an age-appropriate man who seemed to like her and wanted to spend time with her. The fact that he was also presumably aware she was one of the wealthiest women in America may have complicated his interest in ways that made it impossible to determine how much he liked her, versus how much he liked what she represented financially. But that didn't make Huguette's feelings any less real, or her hope any less genuine that maybe this could work, that maybe she could have the normal life that wealth and isolation had made seem impossible. They became engaged, and the announcement made newspapers from coast to coast because copper heiress to marry law student was exactly the kind of society news that sold papers in 1928, when people were genuinely interested in what wealthy people were doing and who they were marrying. And the engagement probably generated endless speculation in society columns and drawing rooms about whether this was a love match or a calculated marriage for money, or some complicated combination of both that couldn't be neatly categorized. Anna was reportedly skeptical of the engagement, which would be completely understandable given that her late husband had spent literally years warning about exactly this scenario. An appropriately aged man of modest means, courting their wealthy daughter, and probably wanting her money more than he wanted her. But Anna didn't prevent the marriage, didn't put her foot down, and forbid it the way she could have as Huguette's mother, and the person controlling access to at least some of the Clark fortune. Perhaps she hoped marriage would give Huguette some structure and purpose, some entry into normal adult life beyond painting in isolation, some chance at the happiness that had eluded her so far. Perhaps she was too worn down by grief over William's death and André's death and years of isolation to fight another battle, especially when Huguette seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. Perhaps she thought, reasonably enough, that Huguette was legally an adult, capable of making her own decisions, even if those decisions might be mistakes, and that preventing the marriage would just breed resentment and possibly drive Huguette away. They married on August 18, 1928, in a ceremony at the Santa Barbara Biltmore, which was appropriately luxurious but notably small and private. Just family present, no grand society wedding with hundreds of guests and elaborate flowers and newspaper coverage and all the spectacle that usually accompanied unions between wealthy families, and that Anna and Huguette probably could have arranged if they'd wanted to. Just a quiet exchange of vows that made Huguette Mrs. William Gower, and presumably gave them both hope for a happy future together, or at least gave Huguette hope, while Gower was hopefully also hoping for happiness, and not just calculating how to access her fortune. And then came the wedding night. And whatever happened in that hotel room was bad enough that the marriage effectively ended before it really began, which must have been spectacularly traumatic for everyone involved, but especially for Huguette, who'd finally taken a chance on human connection and had it go catastrophically wrong in the most intimate and vulnerable context possible. What exactly happened isn't public record, and will never be public record because this was 1928, when such things were absolutely not discussed in polite society or documented in newspapers that respectable people read. And probably Huguette herself never fully explained it to anyone beyond her lawyers in the divorce proceedings. But the results were clear and documented enough that we know some things for certain. The marriage was never consummated, which means whatever happened, actual intercourse didn't occur, either because Huguette refused or because something went so wrong that it became impossible to proceed. Huguette was profoundly distressed by whatever did happen, distressed enough that she immediately wanted out of the marriage and began living separately from Gower, essentially from that night forward. Court documents from the eventual divorce proceedings make oblique references to mental cruelty and incompatibility, which in 1920s divorce language was vague enough to cover everything from genuine physical or emotional abuse to simple, irreconcilable differences to, we tried sex, and it was such a disaster that we both want to pretend this marriage never happened. Wow. Whether Gower was abusive in ways that traumatized her, whether Huguette's complete lack of preparation for physical intimacy made even a normal wedding night feel impossible and overwhelming, whether there were expectations on either side that couldn't be met because they'd never actually discussed what they wanted or needed, whether the whole thing was simply a catastrophic mismatch of two people who should never have gotten married but did anyway because social pressure and loneliness and hope can make people make really questionable decisions. We simply don't know, and will never know. What we do know is that almost immediately after the wedding night, they began living completely separate lives, while maintaining the legal fiction of being married, because divorce in 1928 was still seriously scandalous and socially damaging in ways that made people endure unhappy marriages for years rather than face the stigma of divorce. Gower pursued his law career in his own apartments with his own life, presumably having some complex feelings about the whole situation that we'll never fully understand. Huguette returned to her mother's apartment and her art studio and her carefully controlled routine, probably feeling like her worst fears about human connection had been confirmed in the most horrible way possible. It's a bit like modern couples who technically stay married for insurance or tax purposes, while living completely separate lives, and maybe not even speaking to each other, except with significantly more social pressure to maintain appearances, because divorce in 1928 would mark you as somehow defective or immoral in ways that would affect your entire social standing. And also, there was no such thing as no-fault divorce, so you had to actually prove wrongdoing, rather than just saying you weren't compatible and wanted to split up. The marriage limped along in this zombie state for nearly a year, both of them presumably miserable but locked into a situation that was embarrassing to continue and scandalous to end, until Huguette finally filed for divorce on September 16, 1930, probably after consulting extensively with lawyers about how to minimize the scandal and protect her reputation as much as possible. The divorce was granted on grounds of mental cruelty, which was intentionally vague. The proceedings were kept as quiet as money and influence could keep them, which was fairly quiet, in an era before our modern obsession with publicizing every detail of celebrity lives, and both parties emerged from it, apparently eager to pretend the whole thing had never happened, and never speak of it, or to each other again. Huguette got her freedom back and returned to her previous life, as if the marriage had been a brief nightmare that was now over. Gower got nothing, apparently, or at least nothing significant enough to show up in historical records, which is actually kind of interesting because if he'd been purely a fortune hunter, he failed so spectacularly, it's almost impressive. He'd been legally married to one of America's wealthiest women, had theoretically had access to her fortune during that marriage, and walked away with no significant financial compensation or settlement, no ongoing support payments, basically nothing except probably some trauma from whatever had gone wrong on their wedding night, and maybe some professional embarrassment from the whole situation. Either he genuinely hadn't been after her money in the first place and had actually wanted a real marriage that just went horribly wrong, or he'd been terrible at fortune hunting and somehow failed to extract money from the marriage before it ended, or the whole experience had been awful enough for everyone involved that he was actually happy to escape without asking for compensation just to end the nightmare faster. We'll never really know which, and honestly, maybe it was some combination of all three because human motivations are rarely simple or pure. For Huguette, the whole disaster with Gower confirmed everything her father had warned her about and everything she'd already started to believe through her experiences with isolation and loss and unrequited feelings for Steicher, that the outside world was dangerous and painful, that normal experiences like courtship and marriage led to trauma rather than happiness, that the only safe choice was complete withdrawal from anything that might hurt her, which unfortunately included basically all meaningful human connection. She was 24 years old, divorced in an era when divorce marked you as somehow defective or morally questionable, fabulously wealthy in ways that made her simultaneously desirable and completely unable to trust whether that desire was genuine, and more determined than ever to never put herself in a vulnerable position with another human being ever again, which is understandable as a trauma response, but also meant she was essentially choosing a life of complete isolation at an age when most people are just figuring out who they are. She kept taking painting lessons from Steicher, which is actually kind of interesting considering she'd just had a traumatic experience with a man, and you might think she'd want to avoid male company entirely. But maybe it felt safe precisely because the boundaries were so clear. He was married, he was her teacher, he'd never shown romantic interest. There was a professional relationship that had clear parameters and couldn't hurt her the way the marriage had hurt. The fact that she was still quietly infatuated with him, still writing about him in her diary with the kind of longing that makes you wince when you read it, was something she could manage privately without it spilling over into actual interaction or expectation. Steicher never reciprocated romantically, never left his wife for her, never seemed to see her as anything beyond a talented student who also happened to be a generous patron, whose money funded his lifestyle in ways that made him happy to continue teaching her, regardless of any feelings she might have. that he either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge. Whether he genuinely knew about her feelings and was deliberately ignoring them to maintain professional boundaries and protect his marriage, or whether he was completely oblivious in the way that people can be when they don't want to see something that might complicate their lives, the result was exactly the same. Another lesson for Huguette that wanting connection and hoping for reciprocation only led to disappointment and pain. The 1930s passed in a pattern that would characterize the rest of Huguette's very long life, a routine so carefully controlled and unchanging that you could probably set a clock by it if clocks needed to be set by the activities of reclusive heiresses. She painted watercolors with real skill and dedication, creating delicate landscapes and still lifes that showed genuine artistic merit rather than just the kind of pleasant but forgettable work that wealthy amateurs produce. She collected dolls, which started as a modest hobby, a few nice dolls in a cabinet somewhere, and would eventually become an all-consuming obsession that filled entire rooms with hundreds of elaborate dolls in custom costumes that she'd commission from craftsmen, and then arrange in tableaux that represented something, probably, though exactly what is open to interpretation. She took occasional carefully planned trips, always with Anna serving as both companion and chaperone, always to familiar places where they'd been before and knew what to expect, always brief excursions that were more about checking on properties or fulfilling obligations than about actual enjoyment or exploration. She lived essentially like someone in their 70s or 80s who'd settled into retirement and wanted nothing more than predictable routine and familiar comforts. Except she was in her 20s and 30s, ages when most people are still actively figuring out who they are and what they want and how they want to live, still making mistakes and learning from them and building the foundation for their adult lives. But for Huguette, the mistakes had been too painful and the lessons had been too clear. The unpredictable world outside her apartment had proven itself dangerous through her sister's death and traumatic through her failed marriage. And the logical conclusion was that safety lay in never trying again, never venturing out, never risking connection or change, or anything that might disrupt the controlled environment she'd created, where nothing unexpected could happen because she'd eliminated surprise from her life entirely. And then, on December 7th, 1941, the unpredictable world forced its way in anyway, despite all her careful defenses, in the form of Japanese bombs falling on Pearl Harbor and suddenly making the entire world feel unsafe in ways that even Huguette's carefully controlled isolation couldn't protect against. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor affected all Americans in profound ways, triggering fear and anger and patriotic fervor and all the complex emotions that come with your country suddenly being at war. But it affected Huguette with particular intensity because of her deep personal connection to Hawaii, that made the attack feel almost like a violation of her private space, rather than just a distant military event. The Clark family owned significant property in Honolulu, not just a modest vacation house, but an entire estate that they'd named Halekulani, which means house befitting heaven, in Hawaiian, and which was not false advertising because it was genuinely beautiful, situated on prime oceanfront property with gardens overlooking the Pacific, and the kind of views that people pay millions for now, but which the Clarks had acquired back when Hawaii was still a territory and wealthy mainlanders could buy whatever they wanted. It was a beautiful estate on several acres, where Huguette had spent genuinely happy times as a child and young woman, one of the very few places outside her New York apartment where she felt somewhat safe and comfortable, a refuge that represented good memories rather than trauma and loss. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, when that particular piece of Hawaiian paradise became part of an active war zone, with military installations being bombed and people dying, and the entire place transformed from peaceful retreat into battlefield, Huguette experienced it almost as a personal violation, as if the one place that had felt safe outside her apartment had been deliberately targeted to destroy even that small refuge. The place that had been her escape, her sanctuary, was suddenly part of the dangerous, unpredictable world that she'd been trying so hard to avoid, and there was no escaping it, because the war was literally everywhere, including places she'd thought were protected by distance and isolation. She also faced scrutiny from the FBI that must have been absolutely terrifying for someone who'd spent years avoiding any kind of official attention or public notice, because having significant property in Hawaii right after Pearl Harbor meant you were potentially suspicious, especially if you had any connections that might be interpreted as questionable. The FBI investigated anyone with Japanese connections or Hawaiian property holdings, or basically anything that might possibly maybe indicate some kind of security risk. And while Huguette obviously wasn't actually a threat to national security, unless you count hoarding dolls and avoiding human contact as threatening, the investigation itself was invasive and frightening in ways that reinforced every paranoid instinct she'd developed about the outside world being dangerous. The combination of Pearl Harbor shattering her sense that any place could be safe, the FBI investigation making her feel surveilled and threatened, and the general atmosphere of wartime paranoia and fear apparently triggered something close to an emotional breakdown, or at least what her family and doctors recognized as concerning enough that they worried about her mental state in ways that probably reminded her uncomfortably of her father's warnings about being declared mentally unstable and losing control of her fortune. She gradually returned to what passed for public life in her world. Occasional carefully controlled appearances, brief interactions with the outside world, but with an even stronger preference for privacy and isolation than before, as if the war had confirmed that leaving her apartment was genuinely dangerous, and staying inside was the only rational response to a world that kept proving itself hostile and unpredictable. She maintained a very low profile, even by her already extremely low standards, avoiding anything that might draw attention or require interaction with strangers or expose her to scrutiny of any kind. She did take on the role of godmother to Wanda Steiker, Tade's daughter, which is interesting on multiple levels. It suggests she maintained some kind of relationship with Steiker's family despite her isolation. It gave her a connection to a child that didn't require her to actually have children herself. And it probably fed into her unrequited feelings for Steiker by creating a family-like bond that wasn't actually romantic, but allowed her to maintain connection. She took the godmother role seriously in her own way, sending gifts and money, maintaining correspondence, being present in Wanda's life at least financially if not physically. In the 1950s, as Cold War paranoia replaced World War II paranoia, and Americans became convinced that nuclear annihilation could happen at any moment, Huguette made a purchase that really encapsulates how her wealth enabled her paranoia in ways that weren't available to normal people who had to just live with nuclear anxiety like everyone else. She bought Le Beau Chateau, a 60-acre estate in New Canaan, Connecticut, and renovated it extensively specifically as a nuclear war refuge, a place where she and Anna could flee if New York City became a target, because apparently even in her isolation, Huguette was keeping up with current events enough to know that nuclear war was a possibility, and that having a backup location outside the primary target zone was a logical precaution for someone with unlimited resources. The chateau was beautiful, properly maintained by staff, and almost completely unused because Huguette never actually went there, probably because the scenario that would require using it, nuclear war destroying New York, was too terrifying to contemplate seriously, and also because leaving her New York apartment had become increasingly difficult for her psychologically, even when the reason was supposedly her own safety. She kept paying the staff to maintain it, kept the property in perfect condition, but never visited, which meant she was essentially paying enormous sums to maintain a nuclear bunker that she'd never actually use, which is perhaps the most expensive form of anxiety management ever invented. Around this same time, she mysteriously stopped visiting Belos Guardo, her family's California estate in Santa Barbara, where Andre had died, and where presumably every visit reminded her of that loss in ways that were too painful to continue. The property continued to be maintained by a full staff who showed up daily to care for a house that nobody lived in, gardens that nobody walked through, rooms that nobody occupied, all funded by Huguette's fortune, which was large enough that maintaining multiple empty mansions barely made a dent in the income her investments generated. Her isolation was deepening in ways that were becoming genuinely concerning if anyone had been close enough to notice or care. But Anna was also withdrawing from society in parallel, both of them essentially creating a two-person world where they only interacted with each other and the minimum number of staff necessary to maintain their lives. And since Anna enabled and participated in the isolation, rather than challenging it, there was nobody to point out that this wasn't healthy or normal or sustainable. Huguette continued her artistic pursuits with the kind of dedication that probably would have made her a successful professional artist if she'd been born into different circumstances where she needed to make a living from her work. She painted constantly, creating portfolios of watercolors that showed real skill and artistic vision, not just technical proficiency, but genuine creative voice. She also went on occasional luxurious shopping sprees, buying jewelry and art and dolls and various expensive objects that were delivered to her apartment, where she'd examine them and arrange them and rarely, if ever, actually use them, because for Huguette, shopping seemed to be more about the acquisition and arrangement than about actual use or enjoyment. The apartment was gradually filling with her collections. Dolls in period costumes arranged in elaborate tableaux, musical instruments including multiple violins, art supplies and finished paintings, furniture and decorative objects, books in multiple languages, all the accumulated stuff of decades of buying things without ever getting rid of anything. Because why would you, when you have unlimited money and unlimited space and no real reason to declutter when nobody visits anyway? Anna LaChapelle Clark died in October 1963 at the age of 86, having spent the last several decades of her life in increasingly complete isolation with her daughter, the two of them creating a hermetically sealed world where nobody else really existed in any meaningful way. For Huguette, who was 57 years old at the time and had essentially never lived independently or made significant decisions without her mother's input or presence, Anna's death was catastrophic in ways that went far beyond normal grief over losing a parent. Anna had been her constant companion, her co-conspirator in isolation, the person who'd enabled and participated in the gradual withdrawal from the world that had defined Huguette's entire adult life. Without Anna, Huguette was suddenly alone, in a way she'd never been alone before, surrounded by staff who took care of practical matters, but with whom she had no real relationship, living in an enormous apartment that suddenly felt empty despite being filled with decades of accumulated possessions. The changes that followed Anna's death were significant and revealing about what Huguette had been wanting to do, but perhaps felt she couldn't while her mother was alive. She donated Rancho Alegre, one of the family's California properties, to the Boy Scouts, which was a generous gesture that also conveniently eliminated one more property she'd need to think about or maintain, or potentially visit. She renovated her Fifth Avenue apartment extensively, but the renovations weren't about modernization or improvement. They were about creating even more privacy and isolation, ensuring that nobody could enter her private spaces without her explicit permission, essentially turning the apartment into a fortress where she could control every interaction and eliminate every possibility of unwanted contact. She also quietly reconnected with her ex-husband, William Gower, which is one of the more puzzling developments in a life full of puzzling developments. After 30-some years of apparently no contact following their disastrous marriage and divorce, they began exchanging letters and occasional phone calls, maintaining a strange, distant friendship that suggests maybe the catastrophic wedding night hadn't been entirely his fault, or maybe Huguette had processed enough of her trauma to recognize that he'd also been hurt by whatever went wrong, or maybe she was just so lonely after Anna's death that even awkward contact with an ex-husband seemed better than complete isolation. But despite this one attempt at reconnection with her past, Huguette was generally moving in the opposite direction, toward even more complete withdrawal from human contact of any kind. She continued suffering losses that reinforced her isolation. Her Aunt Amelia died, removing another connection to her family and her past, and her physical health began deteriorating in the way that happens when you spend literally all your time indoors avoiding exercise and sunlight, and basically any activity that might be good for you. She stopped receiving visitors almost entirely, even the few people who'd occasionally been allowed into her carefully controlled world. Her only real connection to the outside world became the telephone, which she used obsessively, spending hours each day calling the handful of people she trusted, talking about nothing and everything, maintaining relationships that existed entirely through wires and voice without any physical presence or visual contact. She built a life based entirely on memory and nostalgia, writing obsessive letters to people from her past, cataloguing every detail of happier times, creating an elaborate archive of what her life had been before loss and trauma had made the present unbearable. There was an incident with her longtime chauffeur that seems to have severed even her limited comfort with human proximity, in ways that made the isolation even more complete. The details aren't entirely clear from historical records, but something happened. Maybe he said something that frightened her. Maybe there was some kind of confrontation or boundary violation. Maybe she just became paranoid about his presence. But whatever it was, she fired him and replaced him with an anonymous car service where she'd never see the same driver twice, ensuring that even the minimal human contact of having a regular chauffeur was eliminated in favor of complete anonymity. Her life in the Fifth Avenue Co-op became increasingly strange and confined, to the point where she was essentially living in what had been the maid's quarters, rather than using the main living spaces of her enormous apartment. She'd retreated to a small room, surrounded by a few cherished possessions, while the rest of the apartment sat empty and unused, maintained by staff, but essentially abandoned by the person who actually lived there. It's like she was camping in her own apartment, occupying the smallest possible space, while vast rooms full of beautiful furniture and art and all the trappings of wealth sat unused because they reminded her of times and people who were gone and couldn't be recovered. She continued her intellectual engagement with the world through voracious reading, newspapers, magazines, books in multiple languages, anything she could have delivered to her apartment that would let her know what was happening in the world without actually having to go out into that world and experience it directly. She developed new creative outlets that could be pursued in complete isolation, designing elaborate gold jewelry that she'd have craftsmen create from her drawings but never actually wear, and working on ideas for cartoon animation that suggest she was thinking about storytelling and visual narrative, even as her own life became increasingly narrow and repetitive. And then, in 1991, when Huguette was 85 years old and had been living in near-complete isolation for decades, her body finally rebelled against the isolation in a way that couldn't be ignored or managed through phone calls and avoidance. She developed advanced skin cancer that required immediate medical attention, the kind of cancer that develops when you spend years avoiding sunlight and regular medical checkups, and basically any health maintenance that might require interacting with doctors or leaving your apartment. She was hospitalized for treatment, which must have been absolutely terrifying for someone who'd spent decades avoiding doctors and hospitals and any situation where she wasn't in. But she met a nurse named Hadassah Perry, who would become, in many ways, the most significant relationship of Huguette's entire long and lonely life. For better or worse, depending on who you ask and what you believe about the nature of their relationship. Here's where the story gets really complicated and raises questions about exploitation and agency and what we owe to people who choose isolation, because after Huguette's skin cancer treatment was successfully completed and she was medically cleared to leave the hospital and return to her apartment, she simply chose not to leave, deciding instead to remain in the hospital room indefinitely because she'd found something there that she hadn't had in decades. Companionship that felt safe because it came with clear professional boundaries and a controlled environment. Hadassah Perry was her primary nurse during the cancer treatment, an Israeli woman who was warm and attentive and treated Huguette with genuine kindness and care, or at least what appeared to be genuine kindness and care. And Huguette responded to that attention like someone who'd been starving for human contact, which in a very real sense she had been for most of her adult life. They developed a close relationship that went beyond normal nurse-patient dynamics, talking for hours, sharing stories, creating a bond that Huguette valued enough that she was willing to pay enormous sums to maintain it by staying in the hospital where Hadassah worked. For the next 20 years, from 1991 until her death in 2011, Huguette lived in hospital rooms at Beth Israel Medical Center in Manhattan, paying for private rooms and round-the-clock care that she didn't medically need but emotionally wanted, essentially using the hospital as a very expensive hotel where she could maintain the isolation she preferred while having controlled access to the one person she'd allowed into her life. She ordered takeout food, painted her elaborate dolls, talked on the phone to her lawyers and accountants and the few other people she maintained contact with, and spent hours with Hadassah, who became her emotional center, her primary human connection, her friend or something like a friend, in a relationship that was defined by both genuine affection and massive financial imbalance. And this is where reasonable people can disagree about what was happening, because Huguette began giving Hadassah gifts that were extraordinary even by the standards of wealthy patient gratitude. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, then millions, then eventually tens of millions in cash and gifts and benefits, including buying Hadassah's family multiple properties and paying for her daughter's education and basically providing financial support that went so far beyond normal gratuity that it raised serious questions about whether Hadassah was exploiting an isolated elderly woman or whether Huguette was simply choosing to share her wealth with someone who'd brought genuine companionship into her isolated life. Hadassah's defenders would say she provided Huguette with the only real friendship and human connection she'd had in decades, that she genuinely cared about this lonely elderly woman and brought joy into her life, that Huguette's gifts were freely given by someone who had more money than she could ever spend and wanted to share it with someone who'd been kind to her. Hadassah's critics would say she recognized a vulnerable mark when she saw one, manipulated an isolated elderly woman who was desperate for companionship, and systematically extracted tens of millions of dollars from someone who wasn't capable of making rational decisions about such enormous gifts. The truth is probably somewhere in between, because human relationships are rarely pure and motivations are almost never simple. Hadassah probably did genuinely care about Huguette while also being very aware that maintaining that relationship was extremely financially beneficial, and Huguette probably did genuinely want to give these gifts while also being somewhat manipulated by the fact that Hadassah was literally the only person in her life providing consistent companionship. Other people around Huguette began expressing concerns about Hadassah's influence and the size of the gifts she was receiving, suggesting that maybe Huguette should update her will or at least consult with lawyers about whether these gifts were appropriate, but Huguette refused to update her will for years, which could mean she was being controlled by Hadassah, or could mean she was perfectly happy with the way things were and didn't appreciate other people trying to tell her what to do with her own money. As Huguette entered her 90s and then her hundreds, still living in the hospital room that had become her entire world, concerns about her exploitation escalated to the point where an elder abuse investigation was launched, and her distant relatives, who hadn't seen her in decades and had never shown much interest in her well-being when she was younger and healthier, suddenly became very concerned about how she was being treated and whether she was being taken advantage of by the people who'd actually been caring for her. A guardianship petition was filed by relatives who barely knew her, claiming she wasn't competent to manage her own affairs and needed court-appointed protection from the people who were supposedly exploiting her, which raised its own questions about whether they were genuinely concerned about her welfare or whether they were more interested in ensuring they'd inherit her fortune rather than seeing it all go to Hadassah and other caregivers. The public became fascinated with her story after journalist Bill Dedman published an exposé revealing that one of America's wealthiest women had been living in a hospital room for 2 decades while her magnificent properties sat empty, because it was such a bizarre and compelling narrative. The reclusive heiress, the empty mansions, the nurse who'd received millions, the family fighting over hundreds of millions of dollars, all the elements of a great story about wealth and isolation and the question of what happens when someone chooses to completely withdraw from the world. The hospital attempted to protect Huguette's privacy as she aged and became more frail, limiting access to her room, screening visitors and calls, trying to maintain some dignity for someone who'd spent her entire life avoiding public attention and was now the subject of intense media scrutiny and legal battles. Huguette herself remained largely silent about the whole controversy, continuing to live in her hospital room, continuing her relationship with Hadassah, apparently unbothered by or unaware of the battle being waged over her fortune and her competency. She died on May 24, 2011, at the age of 104, having outlived almost everyone who'd known her in her youth, having spent the last 20 years in a hospital room, having never returned to any of her magnificent properties, having lived one of the strangest and most isolated lives in American history, despite having resources that should have enabled any kind of life she wanted. And then the real war began, because Huguette's death revealed 2 wills. One from 2005 that left everything to her family, distant relatives who'd had minimal contact with her for decades, and another from just weeks before her death that left the bulk of her estate to Hadassah Perry, her doctor, her lawyer, and various other people who'd been part of her life during those final hospital years, essentially cutting out the family entirely in favor of the people who'd actually been present. The legal battle was exactly what you'd expect. The family claiming the second will proved Hadassah and others had manipulated a mentally incompetent elderly woman. Hadassah's side claiming Huguette had been perfectly competent and had every right to leave her money to people who'd actually cared about her rather than family who'd ignored her for decades. The case revealed years of financial records showing the massive gifts to Hadassah, the complete lack of contact with family, Huguette's deliberate choices to avoid her relatives, and raised fundamental questions about autonomy and exploitation, and what we owe to people who choose extreme isolation. Eventually, a settlement was reached in 2013 that tried to split the difference. Hadassah got to keep about $35 million of what she'd already received, but gave up claims to more. The Clark family received over $34 million from the estate. Other loyal friends and staff received their bequests, and significantly, Belosguardo, the California estate. Huguette hadn't visited in decades but had maintained perfectly, was established as a public arts foundation devoted to the beauty she'd cherished, which honestly seems like the ending she probably would have wanted if. So what do we make of Huguette Clark's strange, isolated, extremely expensive life? Was she a victim of manipulation, who spent her final decades being exploited by caregivers who recognized a vulnerable, lonely Mark? Or was she someone who finally found the only people willing to accept her exactly as she was, isolation and eccentricity and all, and chose to share her wealth with them in gratitude? The truth is probably that she was both and neither, that human relationships are too complicated to be neatly categorized as pure exploitation or pure friendship, that she made choices that were simultaneously free and constrained by trauma and isolation that had shaped her psychology over decades. She was born into wealth that should have enabled any kind of life she wanted, and she chose, through a series of traumas and losses and fears that accumulated over a century, to live in a hospital room, surrounded by a few cherished possessions and one close relationship, avoiding the world that had hurt her so many times. Her magnificent properties sat empty, maintained by staff who never saw their employer, filled with beautiful things that nobody used, monuments to wealth that had failed to buy happiness or connection or protection from loss. The 42-room mansion, the California estate overlooking the Pacific, the Connecticut chateau that was supposed to protect her from nuclear war, all of it unused, all of it ultimately given away or sold, all of it revealed as useless for achieving what she actually wanted, which was apparently safety and solitude and the freedom to not have to engage with a world that felt threatening. Maybe the saddest part of Huguette's story isn't the isolation itself, but the fact that her wealth enabled the isolation in ways that weren't available to normal people, who have to engage with the world whether they want to or not, because they need to work, or they can't afford to maintain empty mansions, or they don't have the option of living in a hospital room for 20 years just because it feels safer than their apartment. Her money let her avoid dealing with her trauma, let her retreat completely, let her create a cocoon of isolation that probably felt safe, but also meant she never had to face or process or work through the losses and fears that had shaped her choices. She lived 104 years, most of them in increasing isolation, surrounded by wealth that couldn't buy what she needed, which was apparently someone to tell her that avoiding the world entirely wasn't the same as healing from the pain the world had caused her. But nobody could tell her that, because she'd successfully eliminated almost everyone from her life who might have cared enough to say it.